Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Robin Shepherd. I'm Senior Advisor to the Halifax International Security Forum, a friend of the McCain Institute for many years. It is a pleasure to be here. Since we're 20 minutes already into the allotted time, we'll go over by maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and then the next session will lead into the break. This session is about weaponizing information, a subject which is obviously on everybody's minds. I think Wes Mitchell stated the case very clearly and very well in saying that on that score, as in many others, it's been a long time coming for Western democracies to wake up to a threat that was apparent to countries in Central Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space for quite some time. The guests that we have on this panel today, you have in front of you, but just so you can put name to face, we have Jamie Fly from the German Marshall Fund of the United States at the far end. Next to Jamie is Nathalie Nogared from The Guardian, and I believe previously or perhaps contemporaneously Le Monde. Jamie Kirchik from the Brookings Institution, and Mele Maigret, and it says here Cyber Exa Technologies, which sounds frighteningly corporate, but Mele was a national security advisor to two Estonian presidents, as well as having served at Cyber HQ for NATO in Brussels. So welcome to our panelists. This is going to be a free-flowing discussion, which is perhaps the right thing to do when we're talking about information wars. I just wanted to start off, since this is the McCain Institute's conference, and I was very struck this morning. I think everybody who saw the commemorations of Senator McCain by various people in the very opening panel this morning, and the memory of John McCain is very much a living memory, and one of the things that he fought for was an ideal which he wanted to put into practice, and that ideal, of course, can be summarized in a single word: freedom, which in his conception was neither an imposition nor a privilege, but a right. Now, the political philosophers of this world will debate whether freedom is a natural right, whether it's something that arises through the movement of society, or as Hegel thought, through divine providence and the immanence of the human spirit. The fact is that it is something we have to fight for, and it's something which exists in competition with other ideas. And while we focus understandably in this part of the world and also in Western democracies on the threat posed by a rival system of ideas and a rival system of practices emanating from the Kremlin, it is also something, as the Cold War itself reminded us, it is not just a battle between East and West. That battle takes place within our own societies as well. During the Cold War, there was an enormous propaganda campaign. There was a book that I read as an undergraduate student called Birth of the Propaganda State, about the rise of the Soviet Union. And it was a battle that was fought from east to west, but also within the West itself. When we look at Vladimir Putin's assault on many fronts on Western democracy, the information war, the propaganda war, is obviously in some ways first among them. Not there's a hierarchy of first, second, and third, and that one is more important than the other, but it is a battle that we have to fight. And I wanted to turn first of all to Mele, since you actually are someone who has been in the front line of a frontline states battle with Russian information war. And it strikes me that whilst we shouldn't underestimate, as Wes Mitchell pointed out on this platform, the power of Vladimir Putin and the energy he puts behind it, neither should we overestimate it. Fatalism can lead to apathy, can lead to us not doing anything about it. Could you address the question of how serious the threat is, not in the sense that there's any doubt it's serious, but where does it actually stand in the hierarchy of threats that countries like Estonia and Western countries face, and how, in your experience, are we able to meet that threat?
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, it does work. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the question. And yeah, this is very pertinent. Happy to be back here in Tbilisi, first and foremost, after back in the conference and address this important issue. Indeed, I think that the state propaganda is as old as the states. It's only that it's been more efficient and at low cost now when facilitated by cyber. Speaking from the Estonian experience and speaking from the experience of both the National Security Advisor and former head of the NATO Center of Excellence on Cyber, well, one thing is obvious. We live in a digital age, and while it has brought along lots of benefits, it has also rendered us really vulnerable. And in the context of this panel, I think what is relevant is that digitization has really also overwhelmed us. The human capacity to make sense, to evaluate and evaluate the information is increasingly being challenged. Whatever the Russian effects were on US presidential elections 2 years ago, one thing is clear. It has ended the innocence of social media, and it has definitely ended the authority of traditional media. So it is important first, indeed, as you say, to determine what exactly are we talking about. I think it's also then important to lay out what are the Russian objectives, and I'd be happy to share my experience. And then finally, what can we do about it? What can we do about the Russian threat? So what are we talking about? For me, first and foremost, it's important to maintain, for me, this is not a cybersecurity threat or cybersecurity attack, because no computer systems are really being attacked. Nothing is being hacked. Nor is this a military issue. If we think of cyberspace as airspace, military operations are only a small subset of the overall civil air traffic. However, here in Georgia, it's important perhaps to maintain that the Russian understanding of the importance of information troops was largely increased and accelerated as a lesson learned from the Russian-Georgia war in 2008, when the Russian armed forces were criticized for not being able to deal with the propaganda correctly. And since then, Russian armed forces have set up information troops with a goal to set up an information domain whereby international information domain would be more receptive to Russian interests. However, as General Gerasimov himself said when speaking of the military, that war for him is in a 4-to-1 ratio, 4 being the non-military means and 1 being military means.
Can I just stop right there, because it seems to me that certainly for myself, there is, I think it's very important the way that you delineated those two things, that we think very often of cyber attacks as being this single entity that is coming perhaps from Russia attacking. But in fact, there are two distinct issues, aren't there? There's the issue of attempting to hack into information systems, into military systems, into military communications, into nuclear power stations, into trying to mess things up, if you like, in terms of our cyber infrastructure. And then there's the question of the actual war of ideas. And those two things are often conflated. When you were working at Cyber Command in Brussels for NATO, was that distinction clear inside the structure of NATO? Or was it simply that you were trying to stop, you know, getting involved in communications? Was there a sense that, no, we're also fighting a battle of ideas?
Well, first of all, let me correct this. There is a NATO Cyber Defense Center of Excellence actually located in Tallinn, Estonia. This is part of the network of centers of excellences of NATO. There are altogether 25 of them. And so I worked in Estonia, not in Brussels. But as you say very correctly, I think when we are talking about the information weaponization, for me this is an attack, not that much on cyber hacking per se, but it is an attack against the human intention, the opinion, our understanding of the world. And surely there is mix of the role of the humans, but also automation and algorithms there. So the whole cyber dimension is facilitating this. But above all, it is important to understand that it is not a technical issue, but it is a larger societal issue. And when looking as ways to counter this, first, there is, to a certain extent, of course, the responsibility of the social media platforms themselves, understanding the nature of the threat and understanding their own system and understanding or realizing that this should be a threat and this is a problem in the first place. But also, of course, when looking at it from the national side, you have to understand what Russia's goal is. I think, well, for me, it's been obvious the goal is not so much to send disinformation, but to question the mere fact that there is no single truth. Let me bring an example. The best tragic example, unfortunately, is with spinning of different reasons for the crash of the Malaysia flight in Crimea in Ukraine in the summer 2014, when in addition to there were different reasons spinned for the crashing, be it the Russian rocket, but also a Ukrainian plane, or then the idea that these people were dead in the first place and the airplane was flown to the Ukrainian airspace just to be exploded, or then that the aliens did it. So in this way, Russia is not really, it would be wrong to say that this Russian clumsy disinformation, which is often very obvious to undermine with a real truth. Their goal is not to be believed. Their goal is to send different messages to different societal groups. Often these messages are contradictory, and the whole goal is to create a context where nothing is true and everything is possible.
Right, I wanted to turn to Natalie as a practicing journalist for The Guardian and also for Le Monde. The point that Mele raises, that when it comes, I remember very well when I was working in the late 90s in Slovakia, and there was a case of Vladimir Mečiar was the prime minister, a very nasty piece of work, essentially a gangster, and there was a kidnapping of the president's son, who was stuck in the back of a car, driven into Austria, forced to drink a bottle of whiskey. And this also occurred in relation to the murder of a go-between who understood from the security services and the journalist and the media in Slovakia. Now, in those very specific incidents, just like the Dutch-Malaysian airline crash, it's extremely difficult for anyone to get to a definitive judgment about what's going on. It's very easy to sow discord when it's going to be extremely difficult anyway to find out what exactly happened. And in those cases, as Mele said, then muddying the water is something that someone like Vladimir Putin could do. But what can he do when it comes to the bigger questions about supporting or not supporting liberal democratic rule-based order? Isn't that a kind of losing battle, that Putin can send all sorts of bots into cyberspace, can manipulate however he wants to the question of, of Facebook and Twitter and all this sort of thing. But ultimately, if people in Western society are rooted and believe in their societies, well, Putin can say what he wants, can't he?
Thanks, Robin, for the good question. And it's a delight to be here and to be back in Georgia and with some very dear friends in the room. Yes, it's true. What Mele said is very true. That
to avoid conflict, but it's also important that we show strength so that we
weaponization
deter
of information,
now, when it comes to Georgia,
manipulation of information,
I think you have to
as
do
a campaign
both.
aimed
I understand the need to be pragmatic because Russia's a neighbor. There are natural
goals that are hostile.
Ties, culturally, historically, people to people,
in a coordinated,
trade. But at the same time, Georgia has always been clear about
all
its
of this
identity,
capitalizes
about its sovereignty
on our
and
weaknesses,
territorial integrity,
on our gaps in our systems, more than anything else.
So
but
when I
having
speak with
said
people
that,
in
I
Georgia,
think it is extremely dangerous. I think we actually face an existential danger as democracies. Because if you cannot agree on what the very basic facts are, if you don't even know some of the basic things about what's going on, how can you have a rational discourse? How can you, how can you deliberate over anything? How can you internally as a society, as a country? And how can you even carry out diplomacy at an international level if you never reach a point where you agree on basic facts? So we're learning about this new environment. You pointed out that many people in the West, in Western Europe, were not aware of this problem.
The right
people in
question
Eastern
is
Central Europe were much more aware of it before we were.
Or is Georgia acting in self-defense?
And so there's
Clearly,
been a wake-up
it's
call,
all inside Georgian
and that's
territory,
good. And
it is
now
by
what we're
definition
doing
acting in
is
self-defense.
we're struggling to find answers, and we're struggling to find the solutions. And I think that will still take time, but at least we are aware of the problem. And you mentioned Slovakia, 1998, sorry. There's so many examples now of that today. You know, the one example that strikes me is, do you remember the Lisa case in Germany
John
in early
McCain's
2016?
Is already
there was
enormous and is only
false
going to grow.
information
He had several things
produced
that
and
were almost
spread
unique
by
for a politician in our
Russian
age
propaganda
today.
websites.
He was very
that a
strong
young
and resolute
German
when it
Russian
comes to
girl, a
defending
teenager,
values,
had
freedom,
been
democracy,
kidnapped
rule
by
of law,
Muslim
human
immigrants
rights.
in
He
Germany.
was always willing
And
to
she
fight
had
for those
disappeared
things.
for 30 hours.
Second, he
Her
was willing to
family
stand for those values
desperately
and
looking for her
security
for
at the
30
same
hours.
time. He
And
didn't see
during those 30
our
hours,
national interests or
the
global security
fake
interests
news, the
and
propaganda
values as
websites were
alternatives.
producing all
He
this
saw
news.
them as
And
part
even
and parcel
Lavrov
of the
made a
same
statement
thing. Our
saying
values are
that
our
German
interests,
authorities were
and our
trying to
interests
hide
are our
this,
values.
this crime,
Finally, he
this
was one of those
kidnapping and this
politicians
supposedly
that
rape.
embodied the
30
idea
hours
of
later,
serving a cause
as
greater
all this
than
news had
oneself.
already
He
spread,
was always willing to
she
fight
reappeared,
for others rather
and
than
she said she had
about
lied. She'd
himself
been
or
at a
for
friend's
his future.
house.
He was
you know.
always doing something
And
to try
so
to help a greater
that
cause.
30-hour
And I think
gap
that's a great
of
example for all
confusion
politicians today.
was the weakness of
Thank you.
you know, the whole media environment, that nobody was able to counter the spread of that propaganda and those lies in those 30 hours. So speed, reactivity are going to be very important. And one case where this did work was in 2017, the Macron leaks. I can talk about that more if you like later, but the Macron leaks, remember the presidential election in France, 2 days before the second round, the final voting, there was a massive leak of, I think, 9 gigabytes of data by propaganda websites, spread by alt-right websites, and it was aimed at destabilizing the election and trying to damage the chances of Macron. What happened is that the Macron team and French agencies, official agencies, countered that in several ways. One way they did it is that they called it out. They said immediately when this happened, this is the result of doxing, you know, stealing documents from websites of the campaign and releasing them online. And then they said, beware, because we, the Macron campaign team, were aware of this hacking, and we injected, in the documents that were stolen, we injected false documents. So if you read emails that are released on these websites, be aware that some of them, we fabricated them ourselves to trick the hackers. And so nobody can know what's true, what's not true. As a result of this, partly as a result of this, French media organizations said, we are not going to touch the content of this hacking and this leak because we don't have time to check any of its contents. It's 2 days before the election, so we're not touching it. And this had an effect, actually. It's not the only reason Macron got elected, but it was an interesting counter-reaction to aggressive information manipulation.
Thank you. Jamie Kitchik, Natalie raised, bouncing off Mele, this point that there are very specific instances. This is not a crude attempt by the Kremlin to launch out on largely futile attempts to say democracy is wrong and authoritarian is right and so on. These are very specific instances which sow confusion. I wonder whether, while as Natalie also pointed out with regard to Emmanuel Macron and the election in France, that a rapid response was actually very effective, there's also a danger which we could flag up as in the form of a response, that this is becoming, the Vladimir Putin is the boy who cried wolf. There's only a certain number of times you can get away with this kind of rubbish before people stop believing it. But they will only do that if it's actually flagged up to them that yes, there's a train of events here that is emanating from Russian propaganda and it's actual nonsense. And so every time you try it, there is a diminished effect. Is that something that we can? But of course, this won't happen unless we actually develop the narrative and explain clearly to people that there is this train of false events, starting perhaps with the Malaysia airline crash, about the little green men in Ukraine, about the kidnapping in Austria. If you put this together as a narrative, this could actually be quite effective, couldn't it?
Well, I think, is this working? I can try one of the three that we have here. They told me, you said that, oh wait, this is now? No. Yes? Sorry for the confusion. I think part of the reason why these cases have worked, it's not just what the Russians are doing, it's our own failures at times. I mean, you mentioned the Lisa case. You know, 3 weeks before the Lisa case in Germany, there was Cologne. There was a massive attack by migrants on women in Cologne, sex attacks. And the authorities did try to cover that up. And it was only a couple of days later that the full scale of what happened was revealed. And that was, I mean, I understand it was a probably well-intentioned effort on the part of the German authorities. They didn't want to feed into right-wing narratives, far right-wing narratives about migrants. But I think the costs of trying to cover up something like this are far greater than whatever benefits you get from trying to mitigate anti-migrant feelings. So I'm not aware of the kind of, TikTok deliberations in Moscow about how they plotted out the Lisa case, but I think part of the reason why they thought they might be able to get away with this is just because 3 weeks earlier in Germany, there had been an attempt to cover up a case of migrant crime. And the Russians very cynically thought, well, we can probably take advantage of this. And so much of what we're talking about today, the success of these Russian active measures, they really do depend on the behavior, the integrity of the individuals in our own political elite. I mean, in France, there was a sort of consensus that they were not going to participate or take advantage or exploit Russian active measures. In the United States, I mean, maybe 50 or 60 years ago during the Cold War, we had more of a political consensus about using compromise on our domestic political enemies or opponents in the United States. That's gone now. So, I mean, it was really Marco Rubio, is really the only Republican official I can remember during the campaign, who said, when asked about the WikiLeaks dumps, and Jamie can confirm this because he worked for him, Marco Rubio said, hey guys, you know what? Today it's the Democrats that the Russians are going after. Tomorrow it could be us. So I'm not going to make hay and exploit these revelations, even though they're about Hillary Clinton, and I don't like her, and I'm not supporting her. I'm not going to jump on the bandwagon and play a role, basically be a useful idiot in a Russian influence campaign. And I wish we had more politicians like that and more political leaders in the United States who felt that way, who felt a greater sense of patriotism and sense of solidarity with their fellow Americans, even if they're a member of a different political party. So those are, I think, the 2 points I would make.
Thanks. And you mentioned that, and I introduced Jamie Fly, that you worked for Marco Rubio. You also work currently for GMF, the German Marshall Fund, which I once had the privilege to be a senior transatlantic fellow for. And GMF is taking this rather seriously, the question of propaganda wars. Well, can you just tell us what GMF is actually doing right now in that sphere?
Sure. We've started a bipartisan transatlantic project at GMF to learn lessons from our European partners, including countries like Georgia, about their experiences dealing with this threat, and also looking deeply at what's been going on in the U.S. and making recommendations to the U.S. government and to transatlantic institutions. I think just to pick up on where the conversation's been going, what worries me is that we still, I think, at least in the U.S., are fundamentally unwilling to accept the fact that the front lines are no longer just here in Georgia and Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe, but are really in the middle of our domestic politics. I was struck yesterday when Ben Hodges was asked, what would the U.S. do if the border was moved in a particular place in Estonia, and what would be the response? Well, the scary thing for me is I think borders are being moved in front of our eyes over the last several years. The lines of control are being moved, the front lines are being moved, and in the US at least, we're not stepping up to the challenge. There is, unfortunately, in a lot of our conversation, this sense that, well, this is the new normal because of technology, because of broader issues in our society, we're going to just have to accept this. Well, I think that's what Putin wants. I think it's what other authoritarians want. They want this to be perceived as the new normal because they're going to get away with it. They want to avoid the repercussions. And so I think it's incumbent upon us, certainly in everything we do, to state very clearly what's going on, and then also to come up with much better deterrent policies. And Wes mentioned what the administration has said. Well, they've said, well, this is unacceptable. Well, that's great, but the reality is, as we get closer, less than 2 months now, to our midterm elections in the US, even the administration agrees publicly that this is still going on. So the administration has said it's unacceptable. The Russians are continuing to do it. Just last week, President Trump and National Security Advisor Bolton talked about the Chinese potentially starting to meddle in the US midterms. And we haven't seen a concerted response from this administration actually showing clearly to these authoritarians what the repercussions are going to be.
That phrase, concerted response, is something that I wanted to come back to, and anybody can jump in at this point as they can during any of the questions and answers. And that is, it strikes me that there is always a challenge, I certainly won't say a problem because it's part of our strength, that when an authoritarian state confronts a democracy, an authoritarian state, by definition, is using the power of the state in a kind of unified way, perhaps clumsily, but sometimes quite cleverly. And then, as a Western democracy, we of course don't want to go down that road. We don't want to simply do the same thing in reverse and start inventing stories in Russia to show them, you know, to show them what it feels like. And also the sense of to use the phrase you used, what does a concerted response mean from a Western country? I mean, isn't it simply The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, Le Monde, Die Zeit, and so on, just doing their job? That's what democracies do. On the other hand, there's a question of organizations such as the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States, Radio Free Europe. We do have resources which are in some way related to the state and the infrastructure of the party systems. What actually does a concerted response mean, Jamie? And then perhaps we'll go back across the panel.
I think the first step, and also where we've been lagging behind in the US, is you need political leadership who are willing to clearly state what the threat is and raise public awareness about it. In all of our research and looking at different European case studies, the more you can build societal resilience to these tactics, the better off you're going to be. And the problem we have in the US right now is the actual investigation and the attempt to learn lessons from 2016 has in and of itself become part of the Russians' influence operation. If you go on social media and you just look at a lot of the debates about the Mueller investigation, about some of the congressional efforts to look at what the FBI was doing in 2016, there is a heavy Russian component amplifying certain fringe conspiracy theories about the investigations in and of itself. And so, again, you need clear political leadership to help make the American people aware of what the facts are. So that's the first step. The other piece is, I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned in the transatlantic context. What I've been struck by is that although there's more activity on this issue at NATO, within the EU, you have cyber centers of excellence, you've got strategic communications task forces set up, I'm not sure there's a real valuable government-to-government exchange going on. We and other researchers have briefed the North Atlantic Council on a number of occasions. I've been struck talking to diplomats in Brussels who tell me that the NAC has, at least this was several months ago, had never met in full session to actually discuss this issue of interference within the alliance.
At what level does it become a sanctionable offense? Now, clearly, if it can be shown and proved that Russia was interfering directly in the elections in terms of hacking into email systems, then you could argue that is clearly a sanctionable offense. What if they're just backing a candidate? Is that a sanctionable offense? Or backing a stream of information?
It is in the way they have gone about it, they have violated multiple US laws. As we've seen with the Mueller indictments, even their cyber activity has gotten into there's purchasing ads for American political campaigns foreigners participating in the American electoral process is illegal. So in the US context, there's plenty of information, some of which has now come out through indictments, which is a positive step, and that's part of it. But we haven't taken the same approach that we have with terrorist networks, for instance, in terms of following the money and tying in the illicit finance piece, and actually going network by network and taking these networks down and making these individuals less likely or less willing to even engage in this.
And is there any indication that we are actually pursuing that there is some, that we are starting to look at weaponization of information in the same way as you said, following the money as we will do in counterterrorism?
They're starting to head in that direction, but it's very early, and there's, again, a lot of blowback and debate within American society about how far are we willing to go to punish Russia over this or other authoritarians. And I think a lot more needs to be done, because obviously we have not reached that point where our deterrent message is strong enough to cause them to at least step back or stop their behavior.
If there had been as much, if the support of Russia for an American presidential candidate was as apparent in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or 80s as it was for Donald Trump in 2016, I mean, there's no way that that hypothetical candidate would have won the party nomination, never mind the Republican Party nomination. I mean, Donald Trump was the most, pro-Russian presidential candidate since Henry Wallace in 1948. But the American people voted for him. And so this is a deeper issue within our societies. I mean, I'm continually astounded that someone like Jeremy Corbyn remains leader of the Labour Party, in spite of everything that on a near daily basis comes out about this guy, that he's an anti-Semite, that he is pro-Russian, was pro-Soviet. I mean, literally every enemy of the West this man supports. And it has very little effect on his polling numbers. So this is something within our societies. I mean, this is not an issue of, if we only expose, how bad these people are and how crazy their views are to the American people or the British people, then they'll wake up and they'll realize that we shouldn't support them. Clearly, that's not happening. So I think this is a deeper, we can talk about disinformation and what the Russians are doing all we want, but there is something gravely wrong in the West right now that candidates like this are getting so much support, I think.
Natalie.
There is a lot wrong. Corbyn is not prime minister yet, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing, my opinion. And I think exposing, we must never give up exposing what needs to be exposed. You shed light on something. Very, very strong sunshine can dry up something, that doesn't smell very nice. I think to go back to the question of weaponization of information, because if we talk about everything that's going wrong in our societies, it's a really, really big conversation, but to go back to weaponization of information, I think it's going to, as societies, we're all multi-stakeholders in what we hold dear. We are all stakeholders in the values and the principles we want to protect. So all of us, as citizens, as media organizations, as NGOs, civil society, political parties who have principles and values, leaders, business, it's a stakeholder thing. So we're not going to have one easy, homogeneous answer to this. It has to be, a patchwork of like-minded efforts. And as a journalist, I'm the journalist on this panel, so as a journalist, I do believe, if I have one very simple message, it's that information is like food. We need it to live. We need it to make decisions that help us thrive, that help us be decent human beings. It's like food. And just like with food, you have junk food. Well, with information, you have junk information. So imagine a world where we start thinking along those lines, where when you're shopping to buy your food, you choose the products that you think are going to be good for you. And you can choose them because you know that this product is actually healthier. And you may know that product is healthier because on it there's a label that says, there's a name that says, I contain this and that, I'm produced here, I was transported this way. You have information about the very products you're buying. I think we have to think about information and news in those terms as citizens and as media organizations.
It's also, I'm currently reading and studying for a book I'm doing, Elizabeth Eisenstein, who wrote a seminal book called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, and it's about the printing revolution in early modern Europe. And she and others pointed out that information overload had happened by 1500. 8 million books had been printed in the space of 50 years, when the scribes could only get out 1 or 2 or 3 copies of anything prior to 1440. It's also interesting that erotic fiction appeared before the scientific revolution. So you get a lot of junk and a lot of rubbish before you can actually get to the truth. But it's very turbulent times. I mean, the Reformation and the scientific revolution changed the world fundamentally. And I think that I agree with Jamie, and I take it even further. We're living amid one of the great world historic changes, and it's incredibly difficult whilst you're living amidst that transition to get a handle on what's going on. But right back to this particular question, I wanted to bring in Melly again. Is there anything that you would like to add in terms of what we actually do in terms of responding to this problem? I mean, we can state the problem, and we could state it for the next 5 years. What do we actually do today that we're not doing?
Yes, thank you. This is not working.
I think we've got 2 that work out of 5. So.
Well, we can share. Adding up to you said, Jamie, I think, and answering the question like what we can do, I think you're very right at pointing out that the borders are coming to the west, and it's not just the frontline states that are vulnerable, but at the same time, it is useful to keep in mind that countries like Ukraine, for example, and also potentially Georgia, are used as test cases or labs of these attacks before attention is turned to the West. And let us think of, for example, the way the election system was hacked or attacked in May 2014 during the Ukrainian presidential election. Those were the first attempts, and those were the lessons learned that were then later applied to the US presidential elections. So as a way to counter, to mitigate that vulnerability, I think it is very important to support, to come up with resources from the West, from the side of the US, EU, NATO, to build up the resilience of cybersecurity and integrity in countries like Ukraine and Georgia, to help convene the best practices in making them stronger, because ultimately that way we are making ourselves stronger. Moreover, what can be done at the level of corporate business, at the level of national actors and international actors? And some examples. As I said before, there is some corporate social responsibility to be held both by the large social platforms, but also tech companies in general. And the key there is for them to recognize that there is a problem, because if they do that, then it shouldn't be too difficult to identify activities that are suspicious. At the level of nations, I think what is important here is to underline that each nation has its own culture and history, and therefore the best strategy against the Russian threat really is to have these strategies managed at the country level, tailored to national agencies, because it is at this point that each nation knows best how to build resilience against their vulnerabilities. As countries do that, secondly, I think it's really important that they do a whole-of-nation approach and do that in that coordinated manner. By that I mean cooperation with the national government, intelligence agencies, military, but also the private industry, the research agencies, the civil society, and academia. And when that whole-of-nation effort is brought together, it is important particularly to bring together experts working in various areas, such as people from computer science, but also cognitive science, psychology, security, political campaign, so that we have an interdisciplinary approach. And finally, at the level of EU and NATO, I think some of the good examples are there. Just the fact that NATO has set up the Tallinn-based cyber center already 10 years ago, but also Riga-based Center of Excellence on Strategic Communications. And last and least, I'd like to recommend an effort that EU has been done lately. We haven't really talked about the election integrity. EU hasn't just been talking, but experts at national level in July put together a compendium on cybersecurity of election technology, which is a collection of best practices from EU countries in helping to prepare everybody for the upcoming EU parliamentary elections. And this is a text available when you Google it, and highly to be recommended to anybody who is concerned about either elections at national level or at the EU parliamentary level.
Thank you, Melly. I'd like to open up the question to the audience. And I see the lady in red just there. Please, first.
I think, sorry, Etobuzishvili. In some cases, Russian information operations were preparing the soil for kinetic war, while in other cases, they were the part of active measures. So how do we know that something is a preparation of kinetic war and something is just a part of active measures? Thank you.
Sorry, something is part, I didn't catch the last bit.
So how can we distinguish that something like information operations, Russian information operations, are the part of active measures or they are the preparation of kinetic war? For example, Russia used information operations before a war in Ukraine and war in Georgia, but other cases they were just a part of active measures. So how can we distinguish between those two kinds of information operations?
Well, it really then is about the professionalism of the intelligence services in being able to distinguish, in having the early warning systems set in having the ears and eyes capable of seeing what's actually happening. But it also addresses the prior work at the political level that has been going on in between allies on sharing threat perceptions, so that when the intelligence is actually seeing what's going on and when they are alerting the political elite about it, and then political elite at national level would like to raise this to other allies, that allies would actually hear, so that they would know and they would have a similar threat perception.
Thanks. Let's take two questions now. First, this gentleman here, and second, James Nixie in the 1, 2, 3, third row.
Thank you. Thanks for terrific presentations. So my question concerns modern technologies. So what do you think, how can we specifically modern technologies be used to counter disinformation? Maybe it goes to everybody in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And James, with the red tie, just if you stand up, James, they'll see you.
Thank you. Actually, this is an extension of the last question, which is, but particularly to Merle and Jamie on the right, that is, have your organizations given any thought to what, in information warfare terms, the Russians might do next?
Okay.
So on the issue of technology, Merle raised a good point earlier. I mean, we always argue that we need a whole of society response. So I focused initially in my comments on what the US government should be doing. But in the US, we're starting an extensive discussion with the social media platforms because they obviously created the ecosystem in which this activity has occurred and have created technologies that have now been exploited by the Russians and Chinese and others. They need to do most of the work, honestly, in the US context at least. And unfortunately in the US, because of our system being different than many European governments, it's probably not going to be through regulatory pressure that they're forced to change. And so that's why you've seen congressional hearings trying to draw out information, increased emphasis on information sharing. Some of the tech companies have deployed technology to try to deal with this problem. So Twitter, for instance, is using algorithms to try to figure out which accounts are acting as bots, actually reducing fake accounts. They've eliminated thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of accounts over the last several months, various times, partly by using technology. So there are ways that you can use advanced technology. I actually fear, though, about some of the future tech developments that are coming down the pipeline, leading us in the opposite direction. The Russians in particular have shown that they're very adaptable to these tactics. They change, as Merla said, country to country. They go in, they see what the media ecosystem is in that country, they adapt their tactics to it, and so they use different social media platforms. In the US, it was a wide range of platforms that they exploited. As people move to new platforms, they will likely continue to move with these tactics in the future. And the Chinese and others are probably going to be even more adept at this. So I actually think we need more conversation. We're still fighting the war of 2016 or the ongoing war right now, and we're not actually having enough of a conversation about where future social media platforms go, the increased use of artificial intelligence, things like deep fakes, fake videos, and which can have very disastrous consequences in American politics if you have a fake video or fake image that gets circulated at a key moment in a campaign. We're really not focused on where the future technology is going. We're still arguing about a lot of the things that happened in 2016, unfortunately.
It strikes me, I'd like to bring in Natalie, if I could, now. There is a limit. We're not helpless in this battle, are we? I mean, if I see something on Twitter, which perhaps has been sourced to a bot in Russia, telling me that the capital of Indonesia is Paris and the capital of France is Jakarta, well, I know it's nonsense right away. I mean, democracy has always been about trusting the people. I mean, the American Constitution rather famously starts out, "We the people." People are not absolutely stupid. And sometimes there's a temptation to believe, well, Vladimir Putin can tell us anything and we just believe it. But actually we don't, do we, Natalie?
No, indeed, I think we shouldn't be panicking. We should be determined, just determined to address this problem. But let's not minimize it at the same time. A friend of mine recently spoke to a group of students in England, and he asked them, there was a whole room of students, international students, British students, and he asked them, how do you get your news? And they said, Facebook. And then he said, what's the source? And they said, Facebook. So, and this goes back to my thing about junk food and good food, We need to be able to identify the good food, we need to make people aware of where the good food is, and we need to create the conditions for the good food to be produced. But, I also, this is a side comment, but I do want to throw this in because, we're sitting here, we have great American friends around us, and we've mentioned the question of leadership. We have, as people attached to liberal democracy and the notion of the West defending its interests, we have a problem in the person of Donald Trump. And I do want to raise this on a panel about weaponization of information. Merle, you mentioned the efforts of the EU against information manipulation. Just recently, John Bolton, who's part of the US administration, said that the EU was about the dissolving of national sovereignty in Brussels institutions, and he said, God bless the people of the United Kingdom who decided to pull out of the European Union. This was just this week. We have a problem also with that kind of fake news. I mean, the very fact of describing the European Union, a high-level US official describing the European Union as an entity that dissolves nations. I think that's fake news in itself. I think it needs to be addressed. I think, again, if we're going to try to get back to some of the facts, this has to be addressed. We can't be sitting here and thinking about Western solidarity and hear this kind of comment and not address it. I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you, Natalie, and I think that also speaks to, did you want to come in, Jamie?
Just a brief thing. Yeah. If you want to see a template of really dystopian potential Russian interference, I would look at what's been happening in Chemnitz in East Germany over the past week, where there was a murder committed by some migrants. We've seen massive far-right neo-Nazi rallies. And over the past couple of days, there's been controversy over a video which purports to show some far-right individual chasing down a migrant and beating him up. The head of the German Domestic Intelligence Service has not acknowledged whether or not this video is real. He made some statement doubting the authenticity of it. This has led to criticisms from people on the center left in Germany calling for him to resign, saying that he's sympathetic to the far right in Germany. So I'm not alleging that this video was created by the Russians. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But I can easily see situations developing over the near future where the Russians do fake videos on both sides, faking videos of far-right people beating up migrants, of migrants beating up white native people in Sweden or Spain or France or wherever, and distributing these on YouTube and just letting it fly and seeing what happens. And that's what I'm really concerned about. And I don't think we're really, you can see what's happening in Germany right now. There's no capability to deal with this. The political class, the political leadership is tearing each other apart over this.
We'll take Mele, and then we'll take one final question from the lady on the left there, and then we have to wrap this up. So we'll get everybody to have a final comment. But Mele,
yeah,
please.
exactly. Trying to answer the question, what's coming up, and building on what you said, James. Indeed, I think we are seeing more and more the human-machine collaboration in a mixing of algorithms, automation, as well as the role of humans in manipulating the perception of large groups of users online. And in a way, if one were to analyze this German case, so what was done, this is a typical offensive strategy against a target population, and this is how they do it. First, they take the population and break it down into communities based on interests, politics, hobbies, concerns. Then they determine what in each community, who in each community is susceptible to given messages. They determine what kind of ideas are flowing in these communities and what kind of narratives are going on in these communities. And then, built on the above, using machines also, a new narrative is being designed and pushed into that community. And finally, using monitoring and interaction, they determine the success of the effort and adjust if need be. So this is what we're seeing already, and this is coming on in large quantities, and where the difference is, when we spoke at the beginning of this has always been around, is that now large groups in societies are being influenced.
Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have time for questions because we're going to finish in 3 minutes, but I do want to give every panelist, if they could just simply summarize, what is the single take-home point you would like everyone to take from your contribution? Perhaps start this way and work with the microphone along to Jamie.
Thank you. I'll repeat a message that I gave 2 weeks ago to the EU foreign ministers, saying that these types of discussions on cybersecurity and information security have to become the bread and butter in our foreign and security debate. And it is not so much about sophisticated technology solutions, but it is more about making our leaders, as strategic decision makers, understand that this is a discussion they should be part of, and they have a role in this, and they have a responsibility in this.
Jamie.
I would just stress public education is vital. My colleague Alina Polyakova from Brookings has drawn the comparison to public health campaigns about cigarettes. You know, every child now growing up in a Western country, most countries probably, they know from a very early age that cigarettes are not good for you. And we should similarly promote campaigns just to promote skepticism about information, so that people, you know, check the label, they check where the information is coming from, so that they're not susceptible to disbelieving anything that comes across their Twitter feed or Facebook feed.
It's also true that Jamie's a smoker, so bear that in mind. Okay. Nat.
Please read quality information. Please turn to quality, serious media organizations. We spend a lot of resources producing good news. You know, please come to us. There are all the big names you know them all, the big newspapers. If you read in English, you know, come to The Guardian. I'm not saying this for self-promotion, I'm saying, or my organization's promotion, I'm saying, you know, be aware. If you have, you know, 10 more minutes online, and spend it on quality websites. And contribute financially if you can. We can't continue to send out things for free on the websites. And also turn to the turn to Twitter feeds or websites that deal with all of this with a sense of humor. There's one that I like, it's called Darth Putin, and he tweeted not too long ago, nothing is true until the Kremlin has denied it.
I'll just end where I started, and this is a message not so much for a Georgian audience as my fellow Americans and Western Europeans, is we need to finally learn the lessons of Georgia, which we've been ignoring for far too long. The front lines have shifted, and we cannot let it become a new normal. It's unacceptable.
Thank you. Jamie, Natalie, Jamie, and Mele, thank you very much. Please join me in showing your appreciation. Thank you very much. That was very good.